Hello. So glad to be able to chat with you guys about this. Um, I apologize for not being able to do this live and in person on Thursday, but I hope that this uh, discussion that I'm going to give you today will help you um, prepare for Tuesday's activity and allow you to partake in that more completely. Um, with that, let me get started sort of walking you through the 30,000 foot overview of jurisprudence, right? Um, let me start by saying there's a lot more to jurisprudence than what is contained in the reading for Thursday, right? The reading for Thursday basically talks about a debate between a school of jurisprudential thought and a leading proponent of a different school. And that's it. And there's a lot more to what constitutes jurisprudence and sort of the conversation that's going on in that approach to law than what was captured in the reading for Thursday. So let me give you sort of the broad overview of what jurisprudence is. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the two schools that are represented in the reading, and then we'll give you some applications of, sort of how this works in the real world, right? So jurisprudence is essentially the philosophy of law, right? As opposed to some philosophers that ask questions like, you know, what is truth, or what is justice, or other questions that your philosophy professors may have asked you if you've taken a class in the philosophy department. Jurisprudence asks questions like, what is law? What do we mean when we talk about law? And what do we mean when we say that we're engaged in the act of judging, right? What is judging? And these are sort of the animating conversations that underlie most of the jurisprudential arguments that you see or that we talk about in this class. And there's so many more answers than the ones that I've given you for the reading. So just sort of a very brief discussion of some of the different jurisprudential approaches that we see, right? So we have seen positivism and natural law theory. We'll talk about those two in more detail when we get to talking about Thursday's reading, but other alternatives to jurisprudential approaches include legal realism, and this is more or less the jurisprudential approach that underlies most social science that talks about legal institutions and behavior within those institutions and judicial decision making and those kinds of things. And legal realism basically says, look, the law is whatever judges say it is, and there's not really any sort of rules except the ones that they decide to constrain themselves by. And as you may have gathered, I'm a little skeptical of this approach. I think that it gives us a lot of useful angles on approaching how to ask questions about judges and courts and politics in those arenas. But I also think that it leaves a lot of information on the table in that there are other pieces of the puzzle that legal realism just sort of passes aside and doesn't really engage with very deeply. The other sort of major jurisprudential approach that we are not going to that was not included in the reading is specifically a what's sometimes referred to as socialist jurisprudence, but it's really more accurately referred to as authoritarian jurisprudence. And so this goes back to Soviet legal theorists that sort of descend in their legal thinking from folks like Carl Schmitt and Hans Kelsen, who take the approach that the purpose of law is to support the state and to impose order. And so law has to build off of those foundations, and if it doesn't, then it's not law. Or if it tries to claim that it's something else, that there's something else going on, that in fact what's happening is that it's just a bourgeois deception intended to confuse you. So there you go, right? There's your tanky jurisprudence, if you are so inclined. The two schools of thought that we will be talking about in this class that sort of that the readings focus you on are positivism and natural law theory. Okay, and I'm going to take those in reverse order. I'm going to start with natural law theory because I think it's a little more intuitive. Natural law theory says, look, law operates according to moral principles. And where those principles come from sort of depends, depending on what morals you espouse and what you think are sort of the best moral principles for a society to follow. So you've got, sort of common good constitutionalists like Adrian Vermeule, and folks who are sort of sympathetic to some of Vermeule's approaches, but maybe don't buy into all of the jurisprudential choices that he makes, like Randy Barnett or Chris Green. And then you've got, like, what, for want of a better term, may be referred to as secular natural law theorists. And these are the folks that follow Ronald Dworkin, right? So a lot of the discussion about natural law theory sort of builds around Dworkin's analysis, particularly in, nowadays in Law's Empire. But the broader school is basically dedicated to the notion that law comes from moral choices. And so when there's not some sort of prior action that we can refer to say this is how we decide these cases, then judges come in and they say, well, this is a moral question, and we're going to decide this according to our moral principles, and we're going to exercise our moral judgment. And that's basically natural law theory. And where you think it comes down, sort of depends on what you think about the morals that are being espoused. Positivism, on the other hand, takes the stance that law is a social entity, right? Much like the critical theorists who talk about race and sex, that law is a social construct, that it exists because we all sort of agree that it exists. And so the question then becomes, what do we all agree on? And that's where things get tricky for positivists, because generally what early positivists wanted to say was that if the law came from some sort of lawfully constituted government, then it was law, and there was an obligation to follow it and to obey it, right? I think you can all sort of figure out where the response went, which was, hey, wait a second. The Fugitive Slave Act required free states to allow slave states to basically extend slavery into their territory, just by asserting that a black person was an escaped slave. Law was enacted by a lawfully constituted government. Does that mean that we had an obligation to obey the Fugitive Slave Act? And some positivists went, well, yeah, we did. Yeah, for, whether we like it or not. Other positivists went, that's a really important critique, and we should take that a little more seriously. And we should start asking that question about how do we deal with morally repugnant laws that meet our standard for laws, right? So this standard is referred to as a rule of recognition, in that it is we all use this rule to recognize that an enactment is a law. So, for example, a rule of recognition in the United States is that in order for something to be recognized as a law, it has to have received majority support in both houses of Congress and the assent of the president, right? However, that rule of recognition requires sort of universal recognition, right? When you get into hard cases where people start questioning whether this law is appropriate, then judges start having to ask their hard questions. And sometimes they have really good answers for those hard questions, and sometimes they don't, right? And those hard questions are things like, what obligation do we have to follow a law that is morally repugnant? And positivists say that there is an opportunity for judges to exercise discretion. And that is when the law meets the rule of recognition, but it's not clear how it applies to the facts before them. And so the positivists say that this becomes an opportunity for judges to sort of bring in other principles. And those principles, they say, should be considered as legal principles rather than moral principles. So this is sort of the point where the reading begins, right? And we see Dworkin's criticism of this approach to rules of recognition. We see the positivist response. We see Dworkin's rejoinder, and then there's sort of a fizzling out of the debate, and Shapiro comes in and offers his analysis at that point. One of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind from all of this is that this debate it's not really, I say not necessarily, not really, it's not at all about outcomes, right? Jurisprudential conversations are not about whether this law or that law is good law, or whether this policy or that policy is good policy. Jurisprudential debates are about tools. And those tools can be used to create any number of outcomes, right? So, for example, yesterday, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine about a law review article, and now you know that your professor is a massive nerd because he was spending his weekend talking about a law review article, with a friend of mine, and the question that the article presents is this. Sex categorization has legal consequences, right? It matters. For example, right? If you are categorized as male, you must register for selective service. If you are categorized as female, then there are consequences for health care that can be provided to you, right? And vice versa, right? So when a trans man walks into a Planned Parenthood and says, I'm here for my birth control prescription, people get scrambled, right? So these categories have consequences. And right now, the state of the law is that transness, right, being transgender, is defined as having a gender identity different from your biological sex. Okay, so that is the current standard. This law review article says, wait a minute, we should really be focused on treating this origin category as sex assigned at birth, right? And there's a whole argument around that. It's not really important. But the decision to go down this road, right, the decision to say that we're going to define transness in terms of sex assigned at birth, that's a decision that is sort of independent of jurisprudential schools. So, for example, right, the positivist is going to say, look, this sex category issue, like, we all recognize that we have to have some sort of categorization because there are differences in the needs of men and women, but we also need a categorization scheme that accounts for the edge cases, the people who don't fit into either of those boxes. And because sex categorization is something that's done essentially at a guess on birth, right? The doctor doesn't sequence your DNA to determine your 23rd base pair. They don't do any sort of invasive procedure to determine what kind of gametes are going to come out of you when you reach sexual maturity. They just sort of look down between your legs and go, yep, that's a boy, or that's a girl, or that's puzzling. And then even when it's puzzling, they make a call, right? And so the article argues that this is an assignment, right? And sometimes it's correct. Many times it's correct. But sometimes it's not. And we need a categorization scheme that recognizes that there is a possibility of error. Okay? So that's the positivist argument, is that this is about recognizing the social fact that sex categorization is a process that can be error prone. And we want a categorization scheme that recognizes that it is prone. The natural law approach to reach the same outcome is to say, okay, we are dedicated to this moral principle that folks should be able to live their lives without having to run afoul of the state telling them who they are. And treating this as a biological fact requires us to assume that we are correct and to assume that we know better than someone else about who that someone else is. And this is repugnant to the moral principle of letting people determine their own lives and their own identities. And so we need to adopt a categorization scheme that recognizes that what we are doing is giving people a categorization that may be incorrect, and to afford them the opportunity to offer us corrections. Okay, so two completely different analyses that reach the same outcome. And so that, I think, is one of the things that's going to be key for you to keep in mind on Tuesday when we're going through the activity is that these tools don't determine the outcome. And one of the things that may be helpful to you will be, as you work through the activity, to ask, what is the tool that's being used here? And how would a different tool reach the same outcome? Okay? With that, I'm going to wrap this up. I will see you guys on Tuesday, and I hope you guys are going to like the activity. See you later.